Hi, everybody. I'm Jillian Kinzie, and I'm really happy to be with you today to share a little bit about what I have been exploring via NSSE and some other projects regarding high impact practices and equity. So HIPS and equity is the topic for today, and I wanted to share some information. So let me begin by sharing my screen, and I will try and get this underway and hope that you can come back and ask additional questions or contact me during the coach time that might be available to you and your team if you're interested in talking about this further. So what I want to talk about today is the topic of high impact practices and equity. And part of the interest in this topic has been because of all the things you see on the right-hand side of the screen that discusses the impact of high impact practices. So the effect of participating in high impact practices, things that we know, learning communities, undergraduate research, service learning, et cetera, that are positive for all kinds of students. But what really has catapulted them into larger prominence and interest is when we discover that there are greater benefits for students who have been historically underserved in higher education. So the idea that we can make sure that these experiences are offered to all students, and even more for students who have been historically underserved or underrepresented in higher education, is even more reason to invest in them. What we also know from the data that we've been collecting for the last 15 years, really pretty systematically via NSSE, is that some groups of the very students we know benefit the most are still underrepresented in these experiences. So we want to do some things to address it, and I hope you're with me in trying to change some practice and design more equitable high impact practices. So with that, let me move on to the next dimension here, which is what we've been exploring is really trying to pursue this joint emphasis on quality, enhancing quality and equity at the same time. And the idea is that just naming something a HIP is not enough to make it so, and that we really have to look at both the quality dimension and the equity dimension in terms of assuring access and participation together. That just pursuing quality is not enough, and just pursuing equity is not enough if we know that the high impact practices are not of high quality. So that's what we've been trying to do systematically. And if you're not familiar with the quality dimensions, this has really been described pretty fully in a number of different publications. More recently in the HIPS at 10 work that George Koo and Ken O'Donnell and Carol Gary Schneider produced that described the very specific 8 quality principles that are parts of HIPS. So I'll be talking about these, but I won't go into depth that they have. Our shorthand for what these quality elements are is that the HIPS should be imbued with high expectations for performance, that they demand time and effort, that they require substantive interactions with faculty and peers, that they are situations in which students have to engage around difference, both in different settings, but also with people who are different, that these are places where students get rich feedback, that the HIPS provide structured opportunities for reflection and integration in learning, and that they are a place to test and apply new knowledge, and finally, that they are sites for demonstrating competence. So these are all the elements in quality. And since 2019, we've been studying at a deeper level whether these qualities are part of students' experiences by asking students, did you have this level of interaction? What level of contact did you have with faculty or around issues of difference? And we reported these pretty thoroughly in a comprehensive report that's available on the NSSE website. So if you do a search for assessing quality and equity in HIPS, you can see this report that really describes the depth that we discovered around the dimensions. It's way too much to go into because it's by HIP and by quality. So there's a lot of information in there. But if you have a favorite HIP, you can explore how well the quality dimensions are represented in it. Now, I'll just give you some really overarching findings here. What we learned is that in general, students are experiencing HIPS at a high level of quality. consistent with what we see in the literature that says what's HIPs emphasize. So for example, undergraduate research is a place where students are supposed to have high interactions with faculty, and that largely is true around that one particular dimension. But we're still seeing some variability in the proportion of students who experience those high quality emphasis. So there's still some variability within the student population. So we can do a lot more still to improve quality. Now, the other thing we thought was interesting to look at in terms of quality is not only the quality elements, but whether students actually were satisfied with their experience. And I want to show you that, but first, actually, I jumped ahead and wanted to show you in this slide, actually, the range of quality dimensions. So you can see in the undergraduate research, there's a tighter band. We don't have as much variability versus in the first year seminar, where you can see in this box and whisker display that the range of scores around first year seminar quality actually is quite significant. Same thing is true for service learning, learning communities, a little bit less so for the others to the right of the screen. Okay, so there's most consistent high quality in undergraduate research, internships, and study abroad, a little bit less in the other dimensions. I mentioned about student satisfaction. We also think that that's a really important dimension of quality. And in this case, students were overall very satisfied. So if they had a HIP, they really appreciated it and enjoyed it. Now, here I give you a little bit more of the range as well about HIP quality dimensions and where we saw the most variability, which is opportunities to reflect, opportunities to integrate, and engagement across difference. There was a little bit less of a range or widespread or variability around the other dimensions, and you can see consistently high agreement around high expectations for performance and public demonstration of competence across the HIPs. Now, these might suggest some things for designing HIPs, where to emphasize more reflection opportunities or more integration across courses or between a course and the experience. So some interesting, I think, ideas related to quality. Now, you know, the idea is quite simply that if we're going to really think about delivering HIPs, we need to be concerned about quality. So we need to design with these quality dimensions in mind. And that's what the lengthier description that I showed you earlier that Carol Gary Schneider and Ken O'Donnell and George Koo referenced in their HIPs at 10. So that might give you some additional ideas about how to design with quality. Now, the other dimension that I want to introduce today that's even more germane to the work you're here to do in the Equity Institute is about the proportion of students who actually get to do HIPs. And if you remember, one of the things that George Koo said at the very early stages, in fact, in 2007 about high impact practices, that we should ensure that all students do at least 2 HIPs, one early, one later in the major, a pretty low threshold really for participation. But even if you look at the results that we've been monitoring year after year, we still see that even that minimal practice is not being fulfilled in terms of just expanding access. So there's still a 15% of seniors who do not participate in any HIPs that are asked about on NSSE. So there's that equity dimension. The other thing that we see consistently is inequities by racial identity. So here I'm just illustrating with internships where we see the overall is 50% participation in internships of seniors, and we see disparities between Black African-American students and Latinx students, both in internships and in research with faculty. This is just to illustrate with 2. This is not news. Ashley Finley and Tina McNair described a lot about the differences in participation and some of the barriers that really have get in the way of students' participation. And they define some deficit-minded practices that are unfortunately consistent barriers to students' participation. So their publication, Assessing Underserved Students' Engagement in High Impact Practices, suggested some ways to work through some of those concerns. Now, where I think we need to go next is how we ensure equity across HIPs. And, you know, there are some pretty straightforward approaches and ways that we can start examining this. First is, if we're committed to having all students participate in high impact practices, we need to start by examining some of our own assumptions, some of the biases that are in place in terms of institutional practices and policies. And then we need to make sure that we're using an asset-based frame to focus on what helps these racially marginalized or underrepresented students participate, and really focus on what facilitates their success and what supports them the most. One of the ways that I think every institution needs to really think about this is by first examining their own students' experiences in terms of asking students who have experienced HIPs, who are racially marginalized or a part of an underrepresented group, that they, what's been their experience? How was it? What was most and least satisfying? Some pretty straightforward questions to put a finer point on your own institutional practices. Now, we actually did that by asking students on our survey about their high impact practice, and we then isolated our data just to racially minoritized students or marginalized students to really better understand their experience. And it revealed something really interesting, that while we saw that presence of all of the qualities of HIPs that have been defined, those 8 quality dimensions, what we discovered with our racially marginalized students is that we actually saw some challenges around 3 of the HIPs and an expanded understanding of what those mean. Time and effort, where students were indicating that they needed more flex, more attention to how high impact practices integrated with their work and other commitments. The other was around substantive interaction with faculty, in that they wanted to make sure that they were having the best experience possible with their faculty, and that they actually were being understood, and that the assets that they bring to the experience were being appreciated fully by faculty and supervisors in settings that wasn't always the case. And then finally, around engaging with difference, they had some different ways of thinking about that as a practice, in particularly really the connections that they wanted to make with home communities, and how that, again, could really be an attractive element of high impact practices. Our examination of students' qualitative responses to the what's been most satisfying and least satisfying also revealed 2 new dimensions, specifically the value that students saw when their HIP experience helped them make a difference for others. When that was a focus of the HIP, that was highly valued. And the other is when they developed a sense of agency and accomplishment, when that was clearly a goal and something they gained from their project. So it suggests some other dimensions of quality that might be more germane to attracting racially minoritized students in high impact practices. This is described more fully in an article in Change Magazine that came out in 2021, and I would refer you to that if you want to know more. Now, to me, there's a pretty specific formula to enhancing quality and equity in HIPs. First, we need to measure, we need to have some data about students' exposure to elements of quality, and it should be pretty specific to that HIP that you're trying to design and implement at your institution. We should establish some thresholds for high quality just to make sure that HIPs are really achieving that. So whether you're like Tennessee Board of Regents, where they have rubrics established to evaluate their high impact practices, IUPUI has well-developed rubrics to assess the threshold for high quality, or you could just ask students in a survey and then determine yourself whether it's achieving that level of quality. And then finally, we want to encourage that you examine student satisfaction, and in particular, underrepresented students' experience, asking them the most and least satisfying elements. Now, if you do those things, it will help you monitor participation and quality, and then use that information to better inform the design of HIPs. So that's a very specific route to enhancing quality and equity in HIPs. And, here I'm just going to throw a whole bunch of questions out for you, just so you might think about some elements that are related to assuring that HIPs deliver on the outcomes you intend. And these might be just some things for you to think about further exploring on your own campus. And then finally, just to use the phrase that Ashley Finley keeps reminding me about, is getting beyond the checklist, which is kind of this oversimplification of we'll just call whatever we like a high impact practice, and to really ensure that we're designing HIPs in intentional ways, that we're not just expanding offerings and sacrificing quality, and that we make sure that equity is not an afterthought in our work. And I want to sharpen this point a little bit more and offer one more resource to you. Again, we know that participating in multiple high impact practice benefits all students, particularly those who are underserved. And we really need to make sure that optional is not the way into HIPs, that optional really is often inequitable. So how might we knit HIPs into curriculum, into programs of study, in general education programs, so that they're more available to students? And I'll offer one last resource. Ken O'Donnell, John Zilvinskis, Jerry Today, and Carleen Vandezan and I, and many, many authors actually contribute to this volume. More than 50 other authors contributed to this edited volume. And I want to make sure that you're aware of what it offers around advancing equity. I'm going to focus on that as when I share this, but you can see in this display the full array of resources that are part of this publication. So there are a lot of really great institutional examples in this book, and I want to, again, focus on equity first, and I'm going to pull, I want that to stop advancing. I want to remind us about the work that Tia McNair and Ashley Finley and Alma Clayton-Pedersen describe related to HIPs. And their work is all about advancing equity. And they have a whole chapter on designing equity-minded practice. I'm sorry for that display. It was supposed to eventually stick, and it didn't. So let me go back and try and make that. I'm not going to be able to make it stick. So let me just say that what Tia and Alma and Ashley describe in their chapter in the book is all about designing HIPs for equity from an equity and design perspective. And they advocate using Tara Yasso's framework of community and cultural wealth to really ensure that HIPs are designed with the 6 forms of cultural wealth in mind. So for example, if you were to really think about the design of HIPs around welcoming what students bring to their experience, and it's designed from an asset base, we would start with students' expectations for performance, what they want to get out of it, how they want to demonstrate what they've learned, versus imposing some standard on high impact practices that may really be about a privileged student's experience. So there are lots of really thoughtful ways that they discuss ways to design HIPs. But the piece that I really want to lift up that Alma Clayton-Pedersen in particular advocates is how to make sure that HIPs are equitable in their implementation. And she raises 3 or 4 points and has an acronym called RIBS, RIBS. And the first is raising awareness about existing HIPs, really making sure that you're reaching out to particular populations and working with cultural support centers to advance racially minoritized students' experiences, that you increase knowledge about why HIPs matter to families and to students. Why should students do this? And that's particularly important for racially marginalized students. That you build, and the B part of RIBS is to build capacity to make HIPs pervasive. So that idea of making them inescapable, and then making sure that racially marginalized students are in those experiences by virtue of their structured in the curriculum. and then that you're sustaining, institutionalizing equitable hips. So really making that an institutional commitment. So I think those are all really important things that Tia, Alma, and Ashley raise in their chapter. The next example I want to draw from is chapter 2, Mapping the Connections of Validation in HIPS, that Adriana Kazar, Ron Hallett, Joey Kitchen, and Rosemary Perez indicated, and they're describing practices that are a part of a comprehensive college transition program at the University of Nebraska system. And what they've described is how HIPS are implemented for what their term is at-promise students. So historically underserved students at the institution really saw the benefit and importance of emphasizing validation, shaping the way students interacted with and how they felt supported in their HIP. That again, they even described more fully how working from an asset-based approach made these HIPs more equitable. So I commend that to you. They talk about how it's implemented in the Thompson Scholar program by in this case, these are programs in the University of Nebraska system where the program is very choosy about who is instructing in these programs, making sure that they understand the validating model and that they are affirming and using an asset-based model with their students, that they are really emphasizing those validating notions of teaching, and that they are doing proactive advising with students, and again, using all strengths-based approaches and affirming identity in assignments that students are doing. So there's a really great description of how equity is implemented in HIPS in Kizar and et al.'s chapter. If you want the full take on the model, you can see how equity is the center of our extrapolation on how equity should be realized in HIPS. If we're going to deliver on the promise of high impact practices, we need to definitely be concerned about assuring fidelity, scale, and outcomes, but equity is really at the center of that work moving forward. So I want to thank you for thinking with me and as we try and design more equitable and high quality HIPs. I hope this is really useful to you and want to wish you well in your equity work this year. Thanks, everybody.